The deck smelled of salt and cordite, and Admiral Nathaniel Nimitz swallowed the syllable of a name he hadn't meant to say aloud, Marcus, until the sound itself felt like an accusation. General Patton stood at the rail beneath a bruised sky, hat off, hair a wind-tangled banner. And when he laughed, it was the kind of laugh that could either unnerve a room or open it altogether. "I'll drive them across the Pacific," Marcus said, and the words were too enormous to be a joke. "I'll put my tanks on the water, Nat. We'll roll right across. Cut their line. End this war in 6 months." The plank vibrated as a freighter slipped by. Somewhere a signal lamp blinked Morse like a heart. For a moment, Nathaniel felt the world tilt. Strategic calculations and sea charts drowned out by an older, simpler fear. The possibility that the man who had always been a bold, dangerous certainty in his life was offering him something more than military bravado, was offering a bridge across the distance Nathaniel had learned to keep bridged in private. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. The war had taught Nathaniel how to read maps like sermons, every coast an altar, every line a vow. He had spent decades balancing latitude with conscience, command with compassion, and in the glow of the map room's lamps, he had learned to keep the private parts of himself folded away like blueprints you only unfolded in solitude. That reserve was what had steadied him when he had to sign off on convoys that never came home, what made his hand steadier than most men's when it hovered over a decision that might cost lives. Patton's proposal, ridiculous in one breath and alluring in the next, cracked that careful architecture. If Marcus could bend the ocean to his will, if Marcus could promise victory in a way Nathaniel's charts could not, then every rule Nathaniel had ever lived by came at the price of a choice that tasted like betrayal and desire at once. Marcus Patton carried the war like a second skin, scarred, taut, and gloriously unashamed. He was contradiction in motion, brashness softened by the kind of grief that had taught him to break first before being broken, in the way the sea breaks a ship. He moved towards objectives like a man who had already lost too much to waste any more time. When he spoke of tanks, his eyes were not on strategy. They were on the impossible that made Nathaniel's pulse lurch because it also seemed to be aimed at him. Marcus had a way of removing the stiff collars men put on around the admiral, of speaking blunt truths that exposed the private faltering beneath all the steady command decisions. That exposure was intoxicating, dangerous, and it had become, over the months since their alliance began, an ache that settled into Nathaniel's ribs at night. Lieutenant Claire Hale had a different kind of command, the quiet of numbers and the tenderness of secrets kept for reasons of survival. She worked in a world of ciphers and intercepts, where loyalty meant trusting the human mind with the most delicate of truths. Claire was younger than either of the two men who shaped her days, but age had nothing to do with the gravity she carried. She understood calculus in more than equations. She understood the dangerous arithmetic of hearts adding and subtracting under the pressure of orders. Nathaniel trusted her like one trusts a compass. And so, when she bent over his desk with a folded report and eyes that refused to meet his for long, he felt an intimacy that was not sexual so much as feral, a reliance older than romance, purer than convenience. They had met in a planning room with reinforced glass and the rumble of engines beneath them. Nathaniel had been calculating supply lines. Marcus had been calculating aggression. Claire had been calculating probabilities that made both men's assumptions hazardous. For months, they had navigated each other like tides, sometimes in sync, sometimes pulling apart, always exerting the kind of gravitational force that rearranges everything. Between them had grown a fragile constellation of shared glances and midnight conversations on the Admiral's outer deck, when the ocean felt like a truth too wide to hold in conversation, and they spoke in the small language of hands and silences. The offer to take armor across the Pacific could have been a theatrical flourish from Patton, the general who always spoke in extremes to get a room to listen. Instead, it landed on the command table like a live shell and forced an immediate reckoning. Nathaniel had the authority to approve or halt such an operation. He also had love, an unacknowledged, precarious kind, that made every decision into a crucible. If he said yes, he would bend protocol in favor of a reckless man who cared for him in ways Nathaniel had never allowed himself to name. If he said no, he might lose Marcus not just to a battlefield, but to the bitter certainty that Nathaniel put duty above desire. The maps would fit either way, one route with catastrophic casualties, the other a gamble that promised a swift end to years of death. Neither felt like the honest path Nathaniel had been taught to honor. Claire's role was not incidental. That same morning, while Nathaniel was still trying to hear the cadence of his own heart over the clang of the ship, she approached him with a cipher she had broken, an intercept from a theater they didn't have boots in yet. Her hands trembled as she set the paper on the table, more from the weight of what she'd discovered than from fear. "It isn't just an audacious plan," she told him, voice low. "There are logistics they've hidden, and intel core we won't be able to cover. If Patton moves alone, the casualties will be worse than you can imagine." Her eyes flicked to the map, then to Nathaniel. "You have to know." It was one thing to debate tactics across a room. It was another to be handed an ugly probability in the form of numbers and names. Nathaniel read the columns like a confession. He felt the edges of his control erode. The idea that Marcus could unmoor himself from coordinated command and from Nathaniel's oversight made his chest hurt in the particular way of a man on a ship feeling the wrongness of a storm he hadn't called for. His authority was not ego. It was the final barrier between lives and the insane heart of a plan that might be heroism or hubris. Claire's words hung there, fragile as sea glass. "If he tries it without us, we won't be able to stop him." That evening, the three of them found themselves occupying the same cold bench on the starboard deck, the sky a bruise of pre-storm. Marcus had come purposely, hat in his hands, the air of someone who'd practiced this intimacy with his own reflection. The sea sounded like distant artillery. "Nat," he began, first name, as if to cleave off the distance their ranks demanded. "I've never been patient with waiting on permission when victory is in my reach. You know that. But I'm asking you, not for paperwork. I'm asking you because you're the only man who can see a battle both like a chessboard and like a life." His voice softened in a way that made Nathaniel's breath catch. "Let me take the tanks. Let me end this quickly." Nathaniel could have refused on principle. He could have invoked reason, rank, the irreducible arithmetic of supply and morale. Instead, he found himself reading Marcus for the human failures behind the bravado. The way Marcus' jaw tightened when he thought of losses, the small flinch when Nathaniel mentioned the men he had already ordered into harm. Accepting Patton's plan would not be a purely military decision. It would be an admission of faith in the man who proposed it. Refusing would be an act of cold fidelity to a chain of command that had already become a chain around his own heart. He had learned in wartime that there was no ethical purity, only choices that left you with survivors and ghosts. Claire listened to them speak and felt a heat she couldn't name. She had always been the watcher, the quiet mind that balanced equations. She had not expected the names of the two men who had become her world to rearrange themselves into a love she neither sought nor could easily refuse. She loved Patton's audacity in a way that made her cheeks burn when he laughed. She loved Nathaniel's steadiness as the kind of love that cemented, the kind that made her feel safer than cipher rooms ever had. When she imagined them torn from each other by politics and protocol, the image lodged in her throat like a fishbone. To love two people layered with such different vulnerabilities felt like treachery and devotion at once. The first act of the war's human calculus is always a small betrayal. A courier from higher command landed that afternoon. Orders insisting on expedited action on all fronts and pushing for creative solutions without explicit sanction. The language was bureaucratic, but the message was clear. Find a way that yields victory, and the rest would be forgiven later. Nathaniel folded the page with hands that did not tremble, but felt like they would. Marcus's eyes lit at the hint of sanctioned audacity, while Claire's mouth thinned with worry. "That's how wars are won sometimes," Marcus said, the line between desire and duty a blade, "by making the impossible possible." Nathaniel watched him, and in that moment he saw the man behind the legend. A boy who had watched his town burn in a previous life, who had vowed that nothing would surprise him into inaction again. He saw the way Marcus's bravado masked an old, delicate thing. Shame, fear, a raw kindness that sometimes leaked out when he thought no one was watching. Nathaniel's chest ached with the knowledge that his decision could either be the hand that healed or the hand that betrayed. He had always been careful. Now he had become the hinge upon which more than military gears swung. At night, when the ship's lights dimmed and the men below deck slept to the rhythm of engines, Nathaniel found himself alone on the bridge, looking at a world drawn in lines and impossible possibilities. He thought of Claire's cipher, of the casualty models that made his stomach clench, of Marcus's laugh and the dangerous possibility it hummed of being loved back. He thought of all the sailors whose faces came to him in sleep, faces asking for one more measure of prudence, and of the two people who could be his redemption and his ruin in the same afternoon. When the ship's bell tolled the half-hour and the sea hissed like 1,000 small reproaches, Nathaniel realized the choice was not simply military. It was moral, personal, and human. He had been given a terrible gift, the power to authorize a play that could change the war's course and the shape of his life. The price would be reputation, protocol, and perhaps even the men he commanded. Nathaniel closed his eyes and imagined a different world in which desire and duty coexisted without violence, an image so tender it hurt, and for the first time in a long while he allowed himself to touch it. By dawn, the three of them were already moving in separate, inevitable directions. Marcus drafted memos that were equal parts calculation and dare. Claire decoded a set of logistics discrepancies that suggested Patton's plan would require allies he didn't yet have. Nathaniel drafted a response that could be signed in blood. Between them, a quiet urgency grew, part professional, part private, a pressure that would either fuse them together or shatter the fragile geometry they had tried so hard to preserve. The sea did not care about their arguments. It kept its honest appointments of tide and weather. But the ship carried a human heart that was not honest at all, beating with secrets and longings that no chart could accurately depict. Nathaniel was at a crossroads where every route was dangerous, every detour intimate. He had always commanded men through storms. Now he had to navigate the storm inside himself, where love, duty, and the calculus of war collided. And the first act of that navigation closed on a question that would not leave him. When Marcus offered him the impossible, what would he say? And what would saying it mean for the three lives bound to the fate of an ocean? The first time Claire watched Marcus lose control, she was peering over a map at 0300, eyes rimmed red from too many hours with too few answers. He had been railing at supply lines that did not exist, at admirals who tied hands with red tape, and at men he couldn't bear to see die another day. On the deck, his voice had the softening of broken things. Up close, in the light of the plotting room, it was jagged as flint. "They're sitting on their advantage," he said, voice low enough only she could hear. "We could put an end to this if someone would let me be as bold as I must." He tapped a cluster of islands on the chart as if they were trestles that would hold up a world. Claire watched him and felt the old part of her that loved clean problems, variables, and proofs wrench as if someone had broken a glass she did not know she still treasured. Marcus's anger was not selfish. It was a crucible of rage and aching, a muscle he flexed to keep grief from claiming him. She had seen it knock the air from Nathaniel once. In that way, brave men made room for their doubts by being cruel to themselves. Watching Marcus now, she understood the danger. That compelling blend of conviction and trauma could make a man commander without counsel. That was why she had brought him the intercept. That was why she had to tell Nathaniel when patterns in the enemy's radio traffic suggested traps waiting like teeth. "I can argue logistics all night," she said to Nathaniel later, once the plotting room had emptied and only the soft whir of machines remained. Her fingers traced a line on the printed segments she'd decoded, a tiny, compulsive action that softened the confession. But the numbers say this: if Patton moves without integrated air cover and a diverted flank, we'll bleed men we can't replace. Not to mention, she swallowed, not to mention the political chaos that will follow. If he fails publicly, we'll lose strategic positions on every map we tried to retake. Nathaniel didn't answer at once. He listened, as he always listened, because listening was how he weighed the lives that were entrusted to him. The lamps in the plotting room cast a halo around Claire's head. She looked younger than he felt, a bright thing standing in the middle of thunder. "Has he shown you any plan for naval transport?" he asked finally. His voice was careful, the kind of care that had kept hundreds of men alive. "Patton can state the problem well enough. He is less convincing with supply lines." "He has some sketches," Claire said, the words small as a stone. "But he hasn't accounted for the tidal charts in this sector. He thinks the tanks can be adapted to roll off flatbeds like amphibians. The math doesn't support it. And if the enemy intercepts us—" Her lips set to a line. "He could be walking us into a trap." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. It was one thing to be tempted by the impossible when the enemy was on familiar ground. It was another to be tempted when the sea itself had to be rewritten to accommodate ambition. He imagined Marcus's face in the simple, unguarded way he'd seen it on the deck, brave, raw, offering himself like an argument. He imagined that face bruised by the consequences of impulsive decisions. The responsibility pressed on him like a physical weight. "He believes in motion," Nathaniel said, not unkindly. "It's what makes him sharp. It's also what makes him dangerous." Claire's hand hesitated on the paper. "We need to give him something that keeps him within the frame," she said. "If we can propose a joint operation, naval transport coordinated with air suppression and a diversionary attack, we keep his boldness inside a plan we control. Or we deny him outright. Or," Nathaniel said, slow as a tide, "we let him go and hope the sea is kinder than our numbers say." It was the third option that curled like smoke between them, the option neither wanted to name. Letting Marcus loose would be letting love go unpinned to reason. Denying him would be setting themselves against a man whose devotion, however ferocious, had taught both of them strange loyalties. Nathaniel felt the split like a war on his ribs. They drafted contingencies. Nathaniel wrote memos that dressed urgency in sober language. Claire coded countermeasures into the plans so they could be executed if Patton's outright gambit became inevitable. They tried to fold audacity into safeguards as if you could hem a cathedral with thread. For every measure they shaped, Marcus's presence pressed against the seams. He leaned into them with a kind of ferocity that made Claire's heart lurch in ways she found infuriating, because they made her feasibly human. He started to appear in the plotting room at odd hours, a half-removed uniform, a cigarette held like a prayer.
He talked about men he'd lost, boys with names that stuck in his mouth like coins. He told stories that made Nathaniel smile and wince at once, because Patton's compassion came as an explosive, immediate, hot, and sometimes injurious. "You two are plotting without me," Marcus accused one night, laughter thin. There was a challenge in the words, but not a cruelty. He leaned against the table, his weight a thing that could have been mistaken for patience. "Don't make me the villain when all I ask is to strike." "We're trying to keep you alive," Nathaniel said, the admission more intimate than either of them intended. "And your men." Marcus's face changed, and Claire watched something softened by inches, the way a flag folds when the wind dies. "I don't need you to be my babysitter," he said, but he didn't leave. He couldn't. There was a part of him that was addicted to the way Nathaniel's presence steadied the clamor in his head. There was another part of him, the louder, more dangerous one, that wanted to be ungoverned and triumphant. Small incidents began to splinter the fragile normal they had made. A leaked report, fingered, whispered, passed between allies, reached ears it should not have. Someone in the supply corps joked about General Patton's mad stunt at a mess hall, and the rumor traveled like a disease, distorted and cruel. Nathaniel caught the back-channel inquiry before it became an order, but the damage was done. Higher command had been teased, and people in far-off offices had started to ask questions. Rumors made politics that could scorch reputations. "You can't protect everyone," Claire told Nathaniel one afternoon as they watched a freighter cut its wake in the distance. She was angry at the rumor, at the way gossip weaponized courage into a scandal. She resented Marcus's charisma for the trouble it caused and loved it because it made her pulse rise. "You can try, but your hands are full." "My hands have been full my whole life," Nathaniel said. He sounded older than his years when he said it, and not only because of the lines around his eyes. There was a knowledge in him that was as solid and weary as a keel. Sometimes protecting everyone means making the impossible seem inevitable. Sometimes it means losing men on principle. Claire traced his knuckles with a motion born from habit. Nurses do that with broken bones, trying to feel the fracture through the skin. "Maybe there are some fractures you can close," she said, "and some you can't. The trick is to not make the whole ship break while you are deciding." They were interrupted by a radio call that made both their heads snap toward the speaker. It was short, clipped, breathable with the authority of a man who'd seen too many nights like this. An envoy from Washington, something about political optics, about pleasing the public, about creative initiatives that would reflect well on leadership. The phrase was vague on purpose. Nathaniel felt the world thin around the edges. Politicians loved the idea of bold strikes in headlines. Logistics preferred the long, slow grind of supply and casualty lists. The envoy's voice had the sugar of promise beneath a serrated blade. "Find us a headline," the message implied. "Deliver us a triumph." Nathaniel handed the receiver back with a hand that didn't tremble, but the nerve in his jaw had been set to a constant tightness. That evening, he convened a private meeting that included a small circle of trusted officers. He did not tell them about the way his chest constricted when he thought of Marcus's mouth forming his name like a plea. He did not say the ones about long nights and the way he had learned to sleep with a map for a pillow. He said only what was required of a commander: options, contingencies, risks. Marcus sat at the edge of the table, the posture of a man who both wanted to be in the room and thought the room might be too small to hold him. He listened as they unpacked the models. Every so often, his fingers would drum the wood, a staccato like war drums. Nathaniel kept his eye on him, noting that Patton's jaw had a shadowed set, as if he were listening for permission he simultaneously scorned. "All I ask," Marcus said eventually, when the room had worn its thin on technicalities, "is that you don't take my courage for madness." "All I ask," Nathaniel answered, voice steady as an oar, "is that you don't take our caution for cowardice." It was a bargain wrapped in two sentences that meant more than either of them could say.
Claire watched them, the two halves of a whole that might match, and she felt herself standing on an edge she didn't want to fall from. The plans they prepared were clever, threaded with her cryptography and Nathaniel's maps, but they still carried the possibility of disaster. War was arithmetic designed by grief. The numbers would not comfort them. The friction between desire and duty sharpened into something tangible when an emissary from Patton's staff came to Claire with a proposal, a covert escort of supplies, off the books, to be staged as a training exercise. It would give Marcus the veneer of bureaucratic cover while letting him push the line. Claire stared at the paper and felt a hollow in her stomach that had nothing to do with fear of punishment and everything to do with the knowledge the paper represented. Compromise dressed in plausible deniability. She took the proposal to Nathaniel that night while Marcus was elsewhere, his silhouette a stain against the dark on the quarterdeck. She laid the document between them like a cut. "He wants a back channel," she said. "He wants us to authorize a shadow operation." Nathaniel's expression did not change. "That's a loophole," he said, quietly. "It's also a breach of everything we have sworn as men of organized command." "You're the only one who can close that door," Claire said, "or you can open it." It was the same question, once more. He had to decide whether to place himself on the side of strict order or to bend for a man whose life had become his private weather system. To bend meant playing at deception, shoving truth into a pocket where it might fester.
To refuse meant telling the man he loved, if he could call it love, to swallow his hunger for immediacy. In the silence, the ocean outside the portholes sounded like a held breath. Nathaniel's answer was delayed by an ache so intimate he almost mistook it for grief. He thought of sailors who had died because someone once decided to move too quickly. He thought of Marcus's hand on the rail that afternoon, the way it had looked like a man who had learned to weigh every heartbeat like currency. He thought of Claire, who carried the truth like a lamp in a mine, and of the peculiar tenderness that existed between all of them like a map only they could read. He chose, finally, to offer a third way they had not dared to name. He would not authorize a secret operation, but he would craft an authorized joint plan that granted Marcus a role large enough to satisfy his need for immediacy and small enough to keep his audacity within a ring of safeguard. It would be public, risky, and honest. When he told Marcus, the general's reaction was not the triumphant glee Nathaniel feared, nor the bitter disappointment Claire had expected. Marcus looked at him like a man baffled at mercy. "You'd let me try?" he said, as if the word try was nourishment. "I would let you try, with boundaries," Nathaniel said. "We go together. You get your offense. We keep the intelligence and air support on deck." For a moment, Marcus said nothing. Then he laughed, soft, disbelieving, the laugh of a man who had been offered a bridge at the very second he had been about to jump. "This is either the best strategy or the most shameless romance," he said, and there was warmth in the mockery. Claire wanted to believe it would be amending. She wanted to believe that the public plan would stitch the raveled edges of their lives together and keep each man safe. But as she wondered at the nature of faith in men who fought with engines and honor, there was a small voice in the back of her mind, the part that had been raised on patterns and probabilities, that told her disasters do not always arrive with drums. Sometimes they come as promises dressed in sunlight. The plan was set into motion with the clatter of farewells and suitcase-laden whispers. Men and materials shifted like chess pieces, each of them rerouted to accommodate something that felt both dangerously sensible and heartbreakingly human. Orders were given, charts reprinted, and the world outside kept turning in its indifferent scale. And as the engines woke and the harbor filled with the vaccinated hum of war machines preparing for action, Claire thought of the small ledger she had once kept as a child, lists of things she wished could be different. She crossed out the top item, and for the first time in months, the list felt like a prayer. Nathaniel walked beside her onto the quarterdeck, and Marcus came up behind them, a shadow and a laugh in one.
They were three figures against the gray sea, threaded together with a decision that hovered now as a promise and a threat. The dilemma that would follow, whether their union of strategy and heart would save lives or shatter them, waited like a storm on the horizon, and they sailed toward it with the fragile, dangerous faith of people who had decided to try. The first crack was not loud. It came as a tremor, an innocuous-seeming reroute on a night watch roster that left a convoy 2 hours out of sync and an amphibious flatbed riding a current the planners hadn't meant to test. The second crack was not gentle. A bombardment, sudden and precise, the kind of violence that reads like a response to a map someone else has already drawn. Men shouted, a radio gagged, a signal lamp burned like a dying eye. Claire watched it all unfold like someone reading a proof whose final line had suddenly been smudged. She had been in the plotting room, fingers hovering over the teletypes when the first blips came in. Fuel dumps missed, a relay that failed to switch, an air support window that never opened. Her throat clenched around a word she could not speak. Somewhere a cartographer swore. The room tilted toward an ugly math she knew too well. The tanks could be ferried only if tides cooperated and the transports were on schedule to the minute. They were not. The casualty reports at first were numbers. 20, then 40, then names, then faces. Nathaniel was first to the radio, voice a practiced keel that tried to hold a chaos none of his models had predicted. He barked orders that would keep men alive, but it was the wrong rhythm. The wrong sequence had already been set. He felt the old animal panic that came with helplessness, like the sound a man makes before he reaches for a rope he has no right to hold. He realized too late that something had been moved in their plan, not by the enemy with torpedoes and codebooks, but by someone inside the geometry of their trust. When the first wounded were brought in, the sight of blood became a blade in the middle of the room. Marcus looked at it with the same hunger that had made him propose the impossible. His face, usually a carved slate of bravado, went raw with blame and hurt. He lifted his hands as if to gather the scattered men back into the fold of a single command, and Nathaniel saw in that motion both a promise and an accusation. "Who moved the schedule?" Marcus demanded, and the question had an edge that cut down to bone. Claire's mouth went dry. She had seen the reroute. She had seen, weeks earlier, an emissary from Patton's staff press a paper into her hand and come with eyes that had the urgency of a man who thought silence could be a kind of salvation. He had begged, in half-joked language and in the tremor of someone who would have lost a lot to publicity, for a back-channel authorization. Marcus had wanted a theater of his own, a stage on which to be decisive. Claire had hesitated because she trusted Nathaniel, because numbers were lines that should not bend, because the whole of her training said transparency always. And yet she had liked Marcus, liked him in a way that made her stomach bloom, and she had feared denying him would let something brittle inside him break into ruin. To that emissary she had given a tentative assent, a suggestion of a window, a small shift that she thought would be harmless if handled carefully. She had told herself it was a controlled deviation, a sacrifice of a margin for the sake of keeping both men from tearing at each other. Claire felt Nathaniel's eyes find her just before anyone else did. He read the blankness in her face like a ledger with a missing sum. "Did you authorize anything off the books?" he asked. Her answer should have been a clean denial. It was not. The lie lodged in her throat like fishbone. "I suggested a narrow escort," she said at last. Her voice was small, but it carried a terrible honesty. "I thought, if it gave him what he wanted in a way that kept him inside the plan." Nathaniel's face closed then, a map folded into an impossible shape. He had trusted her with the exact opposite of secrets, with truth.
to discover that she'd carved a corridor of deception, however small, stabbed at the steadiness he cultivated like an armor. "You circumvented command," he said, the words flat as a plank. "You compromised chain of custody. You put men where our assessments did not clear them." Marcus's laugh when he heard that was not laughter at all. It was a sound that had no warmth, only the rusty echo of disappointment. "You did it for me," he said to Claire, and the accusation landed like an accusation of adultery, intimacy worn as betrayal. Claire swallowed. She had not expected the words to land so harshly or with so much ownership. She had acted out of love, or fear of losing it, or 1,000 other motives that make a person do foolish things. She had thought, private and naive, that if Nathaniel knew she had tried to keep Marcus from tearing himself apart, he would forgive the transgression, because he understood what love tended to make of people. Instead, Nathaniel's jaw tightened as if it hurt him physically. "You were reckless," he said. "You let affection override duty." Marcus turned on Nathaniel with the price of all the nights he had not been steady. "And you," he began, voice low and something like pain threaded through it. "You say duty when you mean to say control. You make rules into bars and call them salvation. Is that what you think saving me looks like? Keeping me safe by keeping me small?" Nathaniel's hands curled into fists. For the first time, Claire saw him unmoored from his charts, a man confronting the risk of losing not a command, but a person who had become his nocturnal compass. "I did not make the rules, Marcus," he answered, "but I will not let men die for theatrics." "Men are already dying," Marcus said, and the room went still.
"And you will choose to count their lives and not their hearts." The argument that followed was not just about strategy. It stripped them bare. Accusations were flung that bared their private architecture. Claire's of favoritism, Nathaniel's of clinical paralysis, Marcus's of being caged. Names of dead men rose like summoned ghosts, lived-out sacrifices that made the air heavier. Voices that had shared confidences now volleyed the deepest vulnerabilities as if they were weapons. "You think I want to be reckless?" Marcus shot at Claire. "Do you not see what's already missing inside me?" His face crumpled in a way that felt dangerous, like a man on the brink of giving everything up. "You think your restraint is noble? You have never had to hold a child's dead hand and tell him the war will make sense." Claire flinched as if struck. She had seen such hands at the field hospitals in memory, but they did not belong in her own life. "That is not the only way to be brave," she said. But the words trembled. "You could have let us help." "You let yourself get helped," Marcus said, turning now to Nathaniel, the man who held authority as if he could bottle storms. "You can reason me into something that makes comfortable numbers. But do you know how it feels? How hollow? When someone like you decides it's safer to live by maps than to live the messy reclamation of being loved?" Nathaniel's response was an old, weary thing. "I am not your enemy, Marcus," he said. "But I am not your accomplice in a plan that will risk men because it's wrapped in your honor." There was a blow in Nathaniel's voice that set Marcus's shoulders to rigid. "You speak as though I'm a child," Marcus said, "like love is some juvenile transgression. And you speak like a man who believes the world owes you what he asks," Nathaniel shot back. "We are not a playground for heroism." Something in Marcus broke then. He laughed, a single sharp sound that was more a tearing. "Then what are we, Nat?" he said. "You and I, we stand on different sides of the same ocean, with hands itching to be held." The room dissolved into a place of grief. Claire felt the space between them widen into something like a chasm. She tried to bridge it with the one thing she could,
truth. "I did it because I thought I'd save us all," she said. "I thought I'd save you, Marcus. I thought—" "You thought," Marcus spat, "but you didn't ask." Nathaniel drew a breath that looked like a man gathering all his best restraint and finding it insufficient. "You have jeopardized men and a strategy, Lieutenant," and the formal address landed like an insult. "I relied on you to be steady. You were not." Claire's legs trembled. The weight of his official rebuke felt like a blow to the inner life she had tried to keep separate from duty. She had been his compass. He had been her anchor. In that sentence, he transformed their intimacy into a chain of command again, cold, procedural, and utterly excluding the private truth that had driven her to make the small, dangerous choice. "You cannot do this to me," she said, the grief raw now. "You cannot reduce everything to briefings and memos. People are not margins you can tighten or loosen at will." But Nathaniel had already imposed the distance. The commanding, careful man she trusted had chosen in the instant of pressure the solid certainty of duty. Claire felt the decision like an amputation. She had been tendered to be the instrument that kept them together. Instead, she had become the wedge. Marcus flung out of the room, boots slapping the deck in a rhythm that sounded like a retreat. He did not look back. Claire leaned against the table and felt every part of her fracture. Nathaniel sat down, pressing his head into his hands in the way men do when the weight is human and not numerical. Silence filled the room like a slow, suffocating fog. That night, Claire resigned her post at the cipher desk in a note that was all business on the surface, but read like a confession in its margins. She could not bear the sense that she had galvanized the very thing she had tried to prevent. She left the note on Nathaniel's desk because she could not imagine leaving without telling him she had loved him in the way people love poles of constellations, knowing they are distant but wanting them to be anchors. The letter said nothing of romantic tenderness. It spoke only of procedure and of the impossibility of working for a man who had chosen to treat her mistake as a crime rather than a human error. When Nathaniel found the note the next morning, dawn already softened on the horizon. He read and felt his chest cave. He had blamed Claire with a distance born of command. He had called her steady until she ceased to be so. He had watched Marcus walk away and mistaken the walk for proof that he had done the right thing. In the quiet after the storm, he realized the cost. Not men in a ledger this time, but a human triangulation that had been shifted into ruin by his need to remain unassailable. By the time the medical launch came with the news that Marcus had been wounded in a skirmish 40 miles from the route, the result of a splinter group he had taken with him, perhaps trying to salvage honor or prove a point, there was a metallic tang to the air. Nathaniel's command became a maze of formalities. He was called to briefings and admonished by allies whose faces looked like judgment. He was asked to make statements. He was expected to be an admiral who could contain both the war and the private weather that raged inside him. At the hospital, Marcus lay with his arm in a sling and his face scratched by brambles, the kind of injuries that spoke of hand-to-hand desperation rather than orchestrated battle. He looked less like the myth Nathaniel had made of him and more like the man who had once stood on the rail and offered himself as a bridge. When Marcus saw Nathaniel, his eyes did not bear contempt. They bore something colder and more devastating, wounded pride and the faint, incandescent glow of a person who felt betrayed. "You left me to rules," he said, voice small. "You left me to be a spectacle." Nathaniel had no answers that satisfied vanity or guilt. He knelt beside the stretcher like a supplicant and realized that in choosing the chain of command over the person, he had not protected anyone. He had punished a man for his bravery and a woman for her love. The triangle that had glowed like a hopeful constellation now lay in pieces at their feet.
None of them could pick up all the fragments without cutting themselves further. Claire, who had not meant to return so soon, arrived as the light fell slant and weak through the ward windows. Marcus reached out and took her hand. An anchor, a plea, a thing that wanted to put broken pieces together with trembling fingers. Nathaniel watched them, and for the first time he recognized in his chest not the pragmatic grief of command, but the personal, indecipherable ache of loss. "You could have asked me to stop," Claire said to Marcus, voice brittle with regret. "I would have followed your orders." "But you didn't," Marcus answered. "You thought you were protecting me by stepping out of the rules. I unmade myself because you sanctified the risk instead of stopping it." Nathaniel felt both accused and absolved, and the contradiction was more painful than either. He wanted to tell them both truths: how he had loved them, how he had been terrified, how he had been wrong. But words of love and words of command were not the same. One would fracture the other. The ward's lights hummed, and a nurse adjusted a blanket. Outside, ships cut wakes through a sea that would not be penned by human grief. They stood there, three figures, bruised and human. The fractures of trust were wide enough that they were no longer sure how to bridge them without more damage. The war outside had demanded choices that made intimacy impossible. The war inside had made choices that now cost them what they considered most private. And in the hollow after the fracture, each of them felt the cold realization of what had been lost. Claire, the steady place she had been trusted to be. Marcus, the belief that he could be counted among those who would protect him from his own bravado. Nathaniel, the quiet love that had become a policy and, as a result, had been unable to save what it wanted most. The sea outside the hospital window blinked indifferent and vast, and the three of them watched its endless, patient horizon. And for once, none of them knew how to navigate back. Act 4. Redemption and Claim. Nathaniel's world narrowed to the scent of antiseptic and the sound of Marcus's shallow breaths. The admiral who could command fleets found himself reduced to the small, clumsy ministrations of someone learning how to care without orders, adjusting a pillow, smoothing a fevered brow, letting his fingers hover over the bandaged hand before daring to touch. It was ridiculous and sacred and horribly human. Claire watched him move, and for the first time understood that his authority could also be the shape of tenderness, measured, deliberate, the kind that did not announce itself with grand gestures, but with steadiness that could heal. Marcus' eyes opened and closed like a tide. When he saw Nathaniel, something in him folded that had been raw and flayed for days. "You chose the rules over me," he whispered, and the words were knife-sharp in their simplicity. Nathaniel had rehearsed speech after speech in his mind and found them all inadequate. Instead, he bent and pressed his forehead to Marcus's fist, an ancient, almost childlike act of contrition. "I thought I was protecting you," he said. "I thought keeping you within the plan would keep you alive. I forgot that protection can also be a cage." Claire sat at the foot of the bed with the cipher note folded in her lap like an accusation and a prayer. She had flung her resignation into the sea, expecting to lose everything, and found, instead, a small, stubborn yearning that refusal had not been final. Marcus caught her eye, and for the first time since the sickness of rumor and miscalculation, allowed a vulnerable grin to crease his bruised face. "You ran toward me," he said softly, "even when you shouldn't have. That scared me, because I could see how much you cared." Words were insufficient. The moment demanded action, an offering that could not be measured in memos. The next hours spun into a plan forged of urgency and humility. Intelligence now confirmed what Claire had feared. The enemy had been alerted by the leaked schedules, and a secondary force, mobile, ferocious, bent on exploiting any crack, had shadowed Patton's detachment. The attack that wounded Marcus had been intended to break them completely.
There would be more attempts if they did nothing. The war outside their private disaster would seize upon the chaos and escalate it. Nathaniel's choice, clear now in the hollow left by his earlier rigidity, was not to withdraw into penance, but to repair. He called the officers he could trust and drew up a counterstrike that was both audacious and careful, a daring pincer that used precisely the audacity Marcus had begged to employ, but wrapped it in the thing Marcus had always defied: precision. Claire recalculated routes and timings, turning the fragmentary data into a lattice of safe passage. Marcus, whose pride had been scraped raw, accepted the plan with a soldier's economy. He asked for nothing more than the chance to lead in a way that honored the men who followed him. On the day they sailed, the sky was knife-clear. Nathaniel stood on the bridge with his hand on the rail, feeling the salt burn like truth. He had the power to sign away men or to save them. This time, he used authority as a promise rather than a lock. He authorized Marcus's offensive, but only as a coordinated strike. His signature a vow that the admiral would be in the line alongside the general, not above it. He made it public, no back channels, no shadows. Transparency, he realized, could be a kind of reconciliation. Claire went with them, not as a resigned saboteur, but as the mind who would shepherd the plan to life. Her place at the operations console was both practical and symbolic. She would stand where decisions became numbers, where mercy met probability. Marcus caught her hand as they prepared to launch, and the touch was an apology and an invitation. "Stay with me," he said, "if you want." She did not pretend the past could be undone. "If we survive this," she said, voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers, "we will carry it forward without lies." Nathaniel watched the two of them and felt, with a clarity that hurt and comforted in equal measure, the shape of what he loved, not ownership, but interdependence. He stepped beside them, the three of them shoulder to shoulder beneath the ship's gray sky, and when the signal to move clicked through the ship, he felt the phrase, "redeem and be redeemed," take on a literal propulsion. The battle that followed was hell and him, engines that screamed like exultation, flares that drew enemy fire into the air, and men who moved with choreography born of a plan that married boldness with restraint. Marcus led from the point where rage met reason, his presence galvanizing the men who had seen both his flaws and his brilliance. Nathaniel coordinated a protective cordon, routing reinforcements where Claire's calculations suggested the enemy would strike. Where once secrecy had cost them dearly, now openness held the line. They saved lives, not all, but many. And when the sun sank over a sea salted with smoke, they counted their men and found more familiar faces than feared. In the immediate afterglow, amid the exhausted cheers and stretchered returns, Marcus reached for Nathaniel in a way that was no longer an offer or a demand, but a simple reaching. He took Nathaniel's hand and, in front of the men and the maps, kissed him. Not a furtive thing, but a claim. It was public at last. A small, defiant act that acknowledged love without disguises. The ship hummed around them like a living thing that had been steadied. Claire stood a pace away, hands clasped, watching them with an ache that had shed its sharp edges and grown into something like peace. Marcus turned to her and extended his other hand. "Stay with us," he said. The sentence no longer an order, but a request threaded with remorse and hope. She stepped forward, and in the space between them a new geometry formed. Three people who had hurt and been hurt, who had erred and redeemed, who had learned that love under fire is messy and demanding and often the bravest strategy. Nathaniel placed his other hand over both theirs, forming a small, fragile covenant. There would be consequences to face, inquiries to answer, and grief that would not be tidy. But on that deck, with the sea's steady voice around them, and the men who trusted them returning to their duties, the three souls made a choice, to carry forward together and let the past be both teacher and wound. Marcus sacrificed the option of solitary glory.
Nathaniel sacrificed a measure of control. Claire sacrificed the safety of invisibility. Each surrender was a claim in itself. They did not promise forever in tidy terms. They promised only this: transparency, mutual guard, and the courage to be human in a world that demanded heroes. The admission was small and enormous at once. As the ship eased into the darkening harbor, Nathaniel watched the horizon and felt, finally, a fit between map and heart. The night drew its curtain, and on the quarterdeck, the three of them stood like a single silhouette against the open sea, bruised but connected, ready to bear witness to whatever would come next. They returned to shore with medals on their chests and questions trailing them like contrails. Investigations came, formal inquiries, polite interrogations, a flurry of telegrams that wanted names, timelines, and a verdict that would fit in a headline. They answered with the blunt honesty of people who had already been broken and repaired, testimonies given not to exculpate but to explain why they had chosen risk for the sake of lives and for the sake of each other. There were reprimands softened by context, a quiet reallocation of duties that cost them comforts rather than careers, and the long, slow work of mending reputations that war had already roughed at the edges. It was not the clean vindication any of them might have wished for, but it was enough to keep them afloat. Claire returned to the cipher room not as an exile, but as someone whose mistakes had been laid bare and whose value was irrefutable. Nathaniel made sure of it with a quiet order that did more than restore her post. It announced, without fanfare, that trust could be rebuilt. He never spoke of the note she had left. The silence between them became an agreement that what had been done in panic would be forgiven in deliberate care. Marcus visited sometimes, for briefings and for the simple, stubborn need to be seen by the woman who had saved them with her mind and nearly lost them with her heart. He learned to ask instead of seize, to temper urgency with counsel. Claire taught him patience as another kind of strategy. They were not the same people who had stood on the deck months earlier. The raw edges of their grief had been sanded into something bearing scars and purpose. Nathaniel slept differently, less a man who hoarded order and more one who held room for frailty. He moved through the ward and the maps with a softened authority that still commanded but no longer extinguished. Marcus, still sometimes reckless, had learned the salutary power of restraint. His laughter returned, quieter but less jagged. Claire kept her ledger of risks, but added, in an unsteady hand, a column for mercy. On a slow afternoon not long after, when the sea lay flat and the harbor's bustle had dwindled to a respectful murmur, the three of them walked the quarterdeck together without mission or audience. They spoke of small things, books read in wartime, a ridiculous dessert someone missed, a child's letter from home, allowing intimacy to arrive as gentle currency instead of urgent plea. When they paused at the rail, watching gulls stitch the light, Nathaniel slipped his hand into Marcus's, and Claire reached for both their fingers, weaving a simple braid of warmth. They did not pretend the future would be easy. There would be funerals to attend, apologies to make, and nights when memories of blown maps would wake them both. But they had relearned a lesson the war had nearly made them forget. That truth, once owned, can be the ground on which people relearn how to trust. The three of them stood there, a steady admiral, a bruised general, a quiet cipher. And the horizon before them was not a plan to be executed, but a promise to be kept. As the sun slid down, painting the world in brief gold, Nathaniel looked at the two faces he had almost lost to caution and to impulse, and felt, for the first time in a long while, a peace that was neither victory nor surrender, but the hard-won calm of people who had chosen one another even after the sea had roared its judgment. The light caught on the water and on their joined hands, turning their shadow on the deck into something like a map. 3 marks connected by a single line toward whatever would come next.